Welcome everyone. My name is Leonie Lindenschmidt, and today I will present you the first keynote speaker. Her name is Dr. Sithembile Mbete, and she's a lecturer in the Department of Political Science in the University of Pretoria. Her topic will be centering the periphery, theorizing African politics. And if you have questions, I would kindly like to ask you to ask the questions in the YouTube stream so we can read them afterwards, after the keynote. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this conference. It's a real honor to be here speaking to a group of young emerging scholars at a time when the world is in desperate need of new ideas and new approaches to solving the major questions and the challenges of our time. So I was really delighted and feel very privileged to have been asked to speak to you all today. The title of my talk is Centering the Periphery, Theorizing African Politics, and it comes from a long interest in my own work about how we speak and write about Africa in academia broadly, but particularly in political science, which is my area of research. What we've seen recently in both political science and in international relations is a concern with decolonization and with really shifting the way in which we engage with the global south from one of marginalization to one of centering and equal engagement with the problems of the global south. This is particularly of interest to me as a political scientist that is based at a university in South Africa on the tip of the African continent, but also who has had my whole education in Africa and yet sees a lot written about Africa in journals and in books, but that continues to treat Africa as an other instead of treating African people and African experiences as common and as similar to those experiences of other people in the world. And I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has provided an opportunity to reckon with the political and economic systems that we've taken for granted, certainly in the past 30 or 35 years, but even longer. And the health crisis of COVID-19 that triggered economic, social, and political crises has really revealed the fault lines in many societies, but also the fault lines between different societies in our supposed global village. Improvements among these fault lines, improvements in global poverty levels that were hailed just a few short years ago as a success of globalization have been reversed, leading to questions about the fragility of the global political economy. It is clearer than ever that inequality is an existential threat facing humanity that exacerbates the consequences of all other threats, such as pandemics and climate change. The moment of crisis that has been presented by COVID-19 provides a good opportunity to examine our political systems and evaluate whether they are indeed fit for the challenges of the 21st century. One of the revelations of the COVID-19 pandemic that I found particularly interesting is that the states and the nations that were assumed to be the most prepared and capable of dealing with a pandemic of this nature were among those that struggled the most initially to contain the spread of disease and to protect their people. An example, two prominent examples, are the United States and the United Kingdom, which are two developed nations that experienced significant loss of life and livelihood from the pandemic and really struggled to get it under control. By contrast, some developing nations, including Senegal and Vietnam, managed to control the spread of coronavirus and employ best practice in protecting their populations. Indeed, Senegal was ranked second out of 36 countries in the foreign policy magazine's COVID-19 global response index. And this should not be surprising. Many African nations have had extensive experience over the past few decades with managing epidemics, the most recently with the Ebola outbreak in 2014. Many African nations have extensive experience of managing epidemics under extreme resource constraints because of poorly developed health systems. And so it should not have surprised anyone that they would have been more prepared to manage the COVID-19 pandemic and to limit the loss of life. If you look at the example of Senegal, Senegal used the state capacity that it developed during the 2014 Ebola outbreak as its framework for responding to COVID-19. Amongst the state capacity was the Health Emergency Operations Center, which really was responsible for managing the pandemic through testing and tracing and contact tracing, and through isolating those who were infected with the virus. But yet, interestingly enough, you didn't see Senegal being held up as an example of excellent pandemic management and being studied extensively by other states and by academics. Particularly, you saw that a country like South Africa, for example, which has a mixed economy that has components of both developed and developing nations, used as its example for how to manage the COVID-19 crisis. South Africa looked towards Germany and towards the United Kingdom initially at the beginning, and towards the United States, and ignored its fellow African state, yes, one that's in West Africa, that was managing this pandemic incredibly well with similarly restricted resources. And this raising all of these issues and setting this context, not to set out pandemic management as a kind of competition, but to raise important questions about how we define expertise and how we define valuable and worthy knowledge, and who we define as knowledgeable and an expert, and who we exclude. Because we really do exclude so much knowledge in our academic theorizing by our failure to take the global south and Africa in particular seriously as a locus of knowledge production. So in this keynote, I'd like to raise some provocations really to get us thinking about Africa as a source of knowledge and theory, instead of merely a place to test theories emerging from Europe. Africa has long been considered a dark continent, which, in the words of Hegel, was devoid of history, and really has been treated as devoid of theory in academia more broadly. The rise of post-colonial and decolonial theory in the past 2 decades has significantly challenged this myopic view. However, the hegemony of the Western canon remains. I am taking inspiration from the late South African scholar Archie Matheje's, and I quote, uncompromising aversion to the epistemology of alterity, which he defined as the othering of Africa and Africans, using the writing of Jimmy Adesina, who has written extensively about Archie Matheje. I argue that the time is long overdue to advance a political theory, an understanding of politics that centers African experiences. Jimmy Adesina calls this a resolute affirmation of endogeneity, a scholarship that is grounded in and driven by the affirmation of African experiences and ontological accounting for the self. And as I said before, this comes within a context of a call for decolonization that scholar Aisha Omar from Wits University says is underpinned by the logic that there is a crucial need to revisit university curricula which continue to be embedded in Western and Eurocentric bias and which do little to promote and reflect African expressions and ideas. Indeed, as Ali Mazrui argued in 2003, African universities themselves have been instrumental in maintaining these relations of coloniality because of their colonial origins and their disproportionately European traditions. And that universities have really been, to quote Ms. Rui again, the major instruments and vehicles of cultural westernization on the continent. So what I seek to do today is to provide some ideas about how we can decolonialize our thinking of politics in Africa and how we can deparochialize the study of politics from its overwhelming Eurocentrism to being more broadly inclusive of other ways of thinking and other modes of thought from other regions. So firstly, I want to make the argument that African political science has perpetuated Western hegemony in three ways. Firstly, what is taught and researched at African universities remains the Western canon. We still teach Plato and Aristotle, Rawls, Weber, Mill, and so that the theories that we teach and that we use as the foundation of our research are Eurocentric. Now, this is not to say that we mustn't teach Plato and Aristotle and Rawls and Mill, but it is to say that by centering these scholars in this thinking as the only legitimate way of thinking through questions of representation, of democracy, of welfare, of redistribution, we exclude so much of the experience of the lived experience of the people that we are seeking to write about. But we also exclude concepts and theories and ideas that may provide better explanations and be more valuable in helping us reframe the questions that we are most concerned with. Secondly, my big concern is that we continue to use and to employ a framework of Western ideas or Western theory and African empirics. What I mean by that is that we uncritically adopt Western ideas and Western theory and then test them in African contexts, whether or not those theories are appropriate. So, there is the meme of the European academics that come to African countries to do field work and to do research in different communities to really study people in Africa as if they are lab rats, that Africa is in many ways the testing lab of the world. But without adopting and adapting without adapting the theories that they come with from the West, using the knowledge and the experience that they gain from the Africans that they work with. We almost take for granted the universality of Western thought and then just apply it to different contexts. And then when these theories fail in African contexts and when they don't hold up in the context of African communities, we, instead of blaming and rethinking the theories, we tend to blame the African context, or to pathologize Africans, instead of questioning the strength and the validity of the theories that we are using. And this is linked to then a third problem, which is of not taking seriously non-Western traditions of thought. The concepts and the theoretical traditions from Africa are not examined as legitimate frameworks through which to understand the world. And moreover, we rarely theorize from African experiences. Rather, we tend to view African behavior as uniquely pathological and exceptional. And we also, curiously, then also generalize African experiences throughout the continent instead of considering the specificities of different regions and nations. So already earlier in my opening, I brought up how differently some West African countries, including Senegal, have approached the COVID-19 pandemic because of their experiences of Ebola, compared to South Africa, where I'm from, which is often considered a continental or regional hegemon. In the southern tip of the continent, South Africa, and to a certain degree, Namibia and Botswana, which have not had similar success in managing the spread of COVID-19 as other parts of the continent. And by not considering these specificities of the different regions and communities and nations, I think that we lose out on a great deal of richness in terms of understanding the human experience. But we also lose out on ideas, on concepts, on theories that could help us to answer some of the bigger questions that we are facing in the globe. An example of this that I want to speak about in my remaining minutes of this talk is democracy. In the past decade, there's been a real rise of criticism of liberal democracy from critics on the left and on the right. For example, Brown, Crouch in 2020, Deneen, Chantal Mouffe's writing from her book in 2019. And this criticism increased acutely in the wake of Donald Trump's election to the US presidency and the Brexit vote in 2016. The election of populist governments in India and Brazil, as well as the turn to right-wing authoritarianism in Eastern Europe, amplified laments of the rise of illiberal democracy that appears to be destroying democratic values in today's globalized world. Indeed, political polarization has been identified as a threat to the stability of democracy globally. By contrast, while other parts of the world have seemed mired in democratic crisis, there's been a great deal of optimism about the future of democracy in Africa, with scholars highlighting the institutionalization of multi-party elections in the 2000s, despite the rest of the world seemingly backsliding on democracy. Nick Cheeseman of Oxford has written extensively in this area. According to recent survey data from Afrobarometer, and I quote here directly, the typical African is strongly committed to democracy and opposed to authoritarian rule, and has remained so for more than a decade. Yet, the democratic systems on the continent have not led to significant improvements in economic well-being and development. There is a pervasive sense that democracy yields suboptimal socioeconomic outcomes and leaves people feeling more alienated from those who govern them. In a prescient article published in 1993, Nigerian political scientist Claude Ake argued that democracy in Africa would have to be designed to fit the cultural context and would emerge from practical experience and improvisation in the course of a hard struggle, close quote. He cautioned against an approach of adopting Western liberalism because this would achieve only the democracy of alienation, close quote. A cursory examination of the continent's democracies indicates that Ake has indeed been proven right. Bob Mattis argues that there is an increase in dissatisfied Democrats on the African continent who are deeply committed to democracy, but don't think that they are getting it from their country's current leaders and institutions. Inequality and poverty persist, making the lives of the majority of Africans highly precarious. Young people in particular bear the brunt of economic stagnation of the continent, with scary statistics such as of the nearly 420 million youth on the African continent, that's people aged between 15 and 35, only 15% is in wage employment. 31% are unemployed and discouraged, and 35% are in vulnerable employment. Youth are also excluded from meaningful political participation, even in the continent's strongest democracies. In 2018, the average age of the 10 oldest African leaders was 80.2 years old, compared to the average age on the continent, which is 19.4 years old. So African leaders are significantly older than the countries that they govern. As the late South African scholar Archie Mafeja argued, democracy must include a conscious and continuing improvement of the conditions of livelihood of the oppressed and exploited mass of the population. And this then is really a problem of both African democracies, but I think of democracies globally, that it is the task of political scientists in the present and in the future to really solve and to think about how do we have representative government, how do we have accountable government, how do we have responsive government, in a time when it seems that our traditional democratic institutions of elections, our court systems, and our legislative systems seem to continue to yield suboptimal results and seem to yield results that don't lead to an improvement of the quality of life of the majority of populations. And so my question is really, how do we use the lived experiences of Africans to understand the inability of democratic politics in Africa to improve the quality of people's lives? What kind of systems do we need for accountability, responsiveness, and participation? Can we identify existing models in societies that we live in to build on? How can we maximize the genuine equity of marginalized groups like women, youth, and disabled people? Can we create systems that bridge the rural and urban divides and don't perpetuate inequality? My contention is that in order to answer those questions, we need to approach our study of African societies and African politics with theoretical seriousness. And we need to approach those sites of study as sources of theoretical knowledge, as sources of theoretical concepts, not merely as empirical sites of study to which we apply theories that come from the outside. And I really believe that if we engage African ways of thought, African concepts seriously, then we will be able to find the tools that will help us to build systems of governance that respond effectively to the needs and the lived realities of people, and that we perhaps will be able to come up with concepts and with theories that can be used beyond the African continent to shed light on some of the major governance challenges facing the world. I'd like to close with a quote from Sithembile Mbete, who has written extensively on decolonization and the challenges of the post-colony in the African continent. And he writes, and I quote, "Decolonizing is not about closing the door to European or other traditions. It is about defining clearly what the center is." And basically my proposition today is that we need to broaden the center in the way that we think about and we approach political science, but also other ways of other disciplines of study, in order to really be able to use all the resources that we have to face the challenges of the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mbete, for presenting to us. We have 2 questions from the YouTube stream. And the first one is there a way to achieve this democracy in a smooth way? So basically, is there the possibility to achieve democracy without being forced from outside to be democratic?
That's an excellent question. And I think that my answer to that question is to somewhat reverse it and say, it's not possible to achieve genuine democracy through coercion from the outside. Democratic systems need to be developed endogenously, and they need to be developed and accepted from within if they are to have any chance of being sustainable or of genuinely changing and improving the lives of the people that live within a given society. And I think that what we've seen in many African countries in the 1990s and into the 2000s is that political elites adopted democratic systems and formal democracy in terms of having regular elections, but without a sufficient connection of those democratic systems to the societies within they operated. And therefore, there's a serious legitimacy crisis that is then facing many of our democratic systems throughout the continent. And you have this distance between national level democracy and which is often formalized and built on the models, on the templates that have been set out by World Bank consultants often, but that there's a real distance between that democracy and the governance systems that people use at local level and the systems of democratic governance that they use to mediate conflicts, to distribute resources, etc. And so I do think that it is possible and it is desirable to build democratic systems endogenously from the inside, rather than having them imposed on countries and on communities from the outside.
Thank you very much. Then there's one more question regarding the cultural adaptation of Western values and Western ideas. Is this desirable at all, or does the culturally adapted understanding still need to be developed on a broad scale?
So I think that there is certainly I think one of the ways in which we need to think, and using Mbembe's idea of redefining what the center is, I think that we need to adopt a view of knowledge production that is one that sees knowledge and ideas as developing in a co-constitutive way through interaction, through social interaction amongst different people, and not just in silos. So for example, the development of Western governance systems, of Western democracy, of Western economies, was profoundly impacted on by the colonial encounter. So Western countries' colonization of Asia and Africa and the Americas didn't just change Asia, Africa, and the Americas. It also profoundly changed Western societies and how they view democracy and the economy, and materially, of course, it changed those societies as well. So when I talk about the adoption of Western ideas, I'm not saying that strictly the adoption of those ideas or the engagement with those ideas in its own is problematic. What I am saying is trying to impose those ideas without fully engaging with the indigenous ideas in the context that those ideas are being applied, is what is problematic. And so I think that we must see decolonization as a conversation between different traditions of thought without privileging one way of thinking over another, and without seeing one way of thinking as higher up on a hierarchy than any other. And I think in that way, we can then really develop ideas and ways of thinking that are appropriate more broadly to many different contexts. And then we can really start thinking of a universal social science or a universal science. Thank you.
Thank you again. Then there's one more question from the streaming chat. Can you explain how democratic systems can be developed endogenously, practically speaking, in countries where existing systems are already in place?
Okay, so for example, in African states, so I'll take an example of Botswana, which is one African country where the contemporary system of the state and the contemporary governance system of the state has not just been a copy-paste of the colonial system, in this case of the British Westminster system, but rather has grown out of existing governance traditions of the Botswana people of Botswana. So the way in which the parliament, which they call the Khotla, works, and the traditions that are followed in terms of consultation and public participation have a lot more, have grown out of the traditions that have been in place for hundreds of years within the community and within the nation of Botswana, and weren't just an adaptation of the British parliamentary Westminster system. By contrast, South Africa has just been an adoption of, and for many reasons that are implicit in the history of South Africa, of the British parliamentary system, of the British court, of the court systems that were inherited from Roman Dutch law, but with very little inclusion of the way in which people think about governance of consultation, of public participation in actually making laws that will apply broadly. And so I think that part of it is with looking at existing systems that existing indigenous systems with a curious eye and with a theoretical eye, to say, well, what can we draw out of this? What concepts can we draw out of this that can help us to build more resilient and more sustainable systems to govern ourselves in the future? Thank you.
All right, so there are no more questions in the chat, but I have some questions myself. Edward
Yes.
Said, he also talks about the othering in his work Orientalism. So that's the first question of mine. How can we overcome this othering? What can the global north and the global south and citizens of different societies and countries do to overcome this othering? And which kind of process do we have to go to kind of prevent this divide between the global north and south? Like, when can we finally speak about being one world, and how can we overcome this divide?
Thank you for those for really great questions. The first way to, I think, and a very important first step in overcoming othering is to recognize mutual humanity and our common humanity. Now, that sounds pretty obvious, but we mustn't forget that the colonial and imperial project was based fundamentally on a view that Europeans were fully human and Africans in particular were not. And so everything from the practice of human zoos to the horrific labor practices in African colonies, to the dispossession of land and taking people's land away from them forcefully, were all based on an idea that the people, African people, and also on a racist idea that people with a particular tone of skin, particular shape of nose, particular texture of hair, were less human than Europeans were. And so, and that is really the beginning of the othering, because it is treating people as an other species altogether, not just as human beings who live in a different way. So an important part of ending that othering and bridging that othering is recognizing that all human beings are actually human beings. And as such, have the needs and the requirements of all human beings: security, shelter, love, companionship, purpose, recognition, are all things that human beings need in order to live full lives as humans. And yet many of our global governance systems treat some people as having a right to shelter, security, love, purpose, humanity, family, and treat others as not having a right to that. A topical example at the moment is the refusal by Western nations or by highly developed nations to allow for a waiver on COVID-19 technologies, to allow developing nations to develop their own, to use the intellectual property that has been developed in the West in order to develop vaccines and whatever other methods are available to combat COVID-19. Now, one would think that after a year of all these messages that nobody's safe until we're all safe, and the messages around how quickly COVID-19 can spread over borders, that there would be a common force and a common endeavor across the world to try and combat this virus and to make sure that vaccines are widely available. And it's a good thing to do pragmatically, so that economic activity can get up to, can start again in full. But it's also a good thing to do in human terms, as humanity, to make sure that everybody is secure and is protected. And yet that is not taking place, and there's been a real battle at the World Trade Organization on this issue. And so I think that part of the combating othering, I mean, even with the Ebola outbreak in 2014, it only started being viewed seriously when there were concerns about an Ebola-infected person having having returned to the United States. And only once Ebola threatened the lives and livelihoods of the West was it then taken seriously as a disease to try and to combat and to treat effectively. And so I really think that the route to stopping the othering is firstly and foremost a recognition of common humanity. The second thing is, what process then do we go through? And what I would challenge all people who are studying in the West to do, and certainly I challenge African and Asian and Latin American scholars to do this too, is we need to read more broadly, to expand our canon and include within our knowledge base ideas and theories from all over the world. Read a variety of authors from a variety of places, and not only, let's say, African scholars who are teaching and who are based in in European or American universities, but African scholars who are based and are writing in Africa, or Chinese scholars who are based in and are writing in China, Indonesian scholars who are based in and are writing in Indonesia. Because I think that by broadening our scope of knowledge and who we read and what we interact with, I think that that almost automatically begins a process of rethinking how we engage with the world.
Thank you. Then one more question came up in the YouTube stream. I think we still have time for that one. In how far would you include questions, the mechanisms of capitalism in the withholding of corona technology?
Huge. I think that at the center, certainly of the COVID-19 TRIPS waiver debate is capitalism and its capitalist logics of accumulation that preclude any way of thinking of technology or of economic resources as a common good and as a common heritage that should be shared to face a massive common problem like this pandemic. So I think certainly the way in which capitalism operates globally and the logic of protecting the interests of corporations and seeing the humanity of those corporations and the rights of those corporations over the rights of a much broader swathe of humanity, I think really is at the core of a lot of this battle around COVID-19 technologies.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mbete, for your insightful keynote. And I think we learned a lot about knowledge production today, and I think there is also a lot of information which is very valuable for us as students to reconsider our own position and to change the perspective. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a great pleasure to be speaking to you today.